Hello, everybody. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are joining us from. Today's webinar, we are going to be talking about event notification options for Force.com applications. But first, we have to talk about our safe harbor statement. No Salesforce presentation would be completed without it. If you have not seen this before, basically this is just saying that if we're going to make any future-looking statements, don't make any purchasing decisions based on that. Now give us a chance to introduce ourselves. My name is Josh Burke. I'm a developer evangelist here at Salesforce.com. You can catch me on the Twitters at Josh Burke. And I'm joined today by Mr. Steve Bobrowski, architect evangelist, and SBob909 on the Twitters. Steve, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thanks, Josh, and thanks everybody for attending today's webinar. We got a great lineup for you, and we're looking forward to talking about event notification systems.
Now, if you'd like to follow us on your favorite social media channel of choice, we do have an official Twitter account at Force.com. If you'd like to give us a shout-out during the webinar, you can use the hashtag ForceWebinar. We also have a Facebook page, a Google/Circle, YouTube channel, and a LinkedIn group. Now, I'd like to give a shout-out to the Architect Core Resources page, which is part of developer.force.com, where we talk about topics like what we're going to be showing you today. This page is updated weekly, and one of the articles that you can find on this page is actually the article that was the source material for a lot of the webinar that we're going to be showing you. Now, if you have any questions today, please go ahead and put them into the GoToWebinar questions pane, and then you can put those in during the webinar, and Steve and I will pick those up towards the end of the show and try to answer your questions time permitting. Okay, so let's talk about the kind of scenario where we see in everyday life. So something happens, and so there's going to be a call to action, and that way we can actually have someone or something act upon that. Or a more specific example, maybe you've got some leaky pipes, and in order to fix those pipes, you've got to call the plumber, notify the plumber, so that the plumber can come and fix those pipes. Let's take that to business. We're going to have some kind of event. We're going to broadcast some kind of a notification. Because of that, we can kick off a workflow or a business process. So today, the example we're going to use is a new lead is created or fits some kind of a status, and we're going to make sure that a salesperson gets an alert. And because they're notified of that alert, salesperson can make that call and make that sale. So a good event notification system doesn't just implement itself. We want to make sure that we're knowing both our requirements and our options. And what we're going to look for today is getting an option that meets there in the middle, where we're going to have something that fits both our requirements and the options that we have on the table. So let's get a little bit more specific onto the requirements that we are going to use today. We're going to say we have a hot open lead scenario. One of the things we want to do is make sure we're notifying salespeople, whether they're online or offline. We want to be able to get notifications to those users as quickly as possible. And we also want to be able to track these alerts. We want some kind of a record that this alert was sent, so if somebody says that they didn't get that email, we can follow up on that. Now, some of the options we're going to show you today are very easy, quick to implement, require no code, and we're also going to be showing you some examples that get into Apex and JavaScript. We're also going to be leveraging different parts of the platform like Chatter and scheduled reports. So what we're going to do is we're going to break this down today. We are going to take some time to go through those requirements, and then we are going to break down the different approaches and implementations that we have. And finally, we're going to show you some demos and source code so that you know exactly how to walk through these solutions yourself. All right, so let's get started. Now that you have a little bit of an understanding of what kind of things we're going to talk about, we need to know our requirements. So Steve, why don't you walk us through some of these?
Sure, thanks, Josh. Okay, let's start today's discussion about event notification system requirements. And what we'll do is explore some things that can determine those requirements. So, for example, let's talk about event importance. So how important would an individual event be in your system? Is it on one end of the spectrum maybe critical, or is it on the other end of the spectrum insignificant? Or, you know, it could most likely be somewhere in between. So if you consider event importance, here are some notification requirements that might surface from that consideration. So when an event is critical, you probably want the notification to happen very quickly. You track who got notified and who responded. But if the event, on the other hand, it's insignificant, well, maybe the notification requirements are probably completely different. So this is a really simple but effective demonstration of how important it is to discover this type of stuff ahead of time. So what about event frequency? This is another thing that can determine event notification requirements. So when an event happens infrequently, it's probably something you want to pay attention to, right? It's rare. Maybe you're going to send out a notification immediately and track who responded. But on the other hand, if you've got frequent events happening, it could get quite noisy, and the opposite is true. So what starts to take shape from the discovery process is a requirements graph. So for example, when an event here in this case is critical and infrequent, the requirements are going to be something like immediate notification, log who gets alerts, and then makes sure somebody responds. And on the other end of the spectrum, maybe if you have insignificant frequent events, you're going to safely defer an event notification and then maybe not worry about accountability and responses so much. But it gets a bit trickier when you have contrasting determinants. So say you have critical events that happen frequently. So in cases like this, well, you're going to have to carefully consider the requirements that make sense in your situation. And you might have to decide to do things like immediate notification, maybe log who gets alerts, but have responses be optional. The really important thing to remember from this entire section now that I want you to take away is you need to know your requirements. You have to put that effort in up front. You have to go off and do the discovery process before you start building your solution.
Now, Steve, as part of the engineering group here at Salesforce, you often work with our enterprise clients, customers that implement these kind of notification systems. I'm assuming that you probably see a lot of problem situations.
Yeah, mostly we hear about implementations that aren't working for one reason or another, but in many cases it's because the system architects, they haven't done the due diligence to ask the right questions up front that help them build a good list of requirements of the project. And so, as a result, the solution that they implement, it lacks in some regards. So, again, it's just really important to do good planning up front and discover those requirements before you start building anything. So I think that's a good point to mention here is that if you want to learn more about the good art of discovery, make sure to check out this upcoming Dreamforce session that TK, Horace, and I will be doing at Dreamforce. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Sounds fun. Improv and discovery.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we have our list of requirements for an event notification system. We have to go to the other side. Let's look what kind of options we have to satisfy these requirements.
All right.
Specifically, we need to know what kind of approaches are possible and the kind of platform features that are going to support those. So today we're going to break down 3 specific solutions: dynamic web pages, near real-time messaging, and deferred messaging. So let's look at the first one, dynamic web pages. All right, so this approach is basically taking some type of web page and notifying users who are going to be looking at that information in their browser that information is changing or information has been added to some kind of record set. So if you think about somebody who maybe is on the stock floor and they are looking at a stock ticker, and based on the information that's coming through that stock ticker, they may make a decision based on whether or not they're going to sell or they're going to buy. This is a fairly similar kind of concept. Now, we are assuming that somebody is going to be sitting there looking at a browser, watching these things coming through, so we're basically saying that it's okay if events are missed, because if somebody is not there to actually see the information come through, then that notification is going to be basically unseen. So, Steve, maybe you can tell our viewers how often you see this approach and how they can do it at Force.com.
Well, it's surprising, but we actually see this approach used quite frequently as the driver for business workflow. So there's been many cases I've worked on where there's absolutely no governance or developer on staff. So what happens is the org has tons of users that are independently going off and creating their own reports or list views that are all very similar to drive this kind of a process. And then users might even go off and get like a browser plugin to constantly refresh the page over and over again so that they're looking at the latest information. So on the other hand, if a developer's on staff and there's some good governance in place for the report or the list views, then the solution might be maybe more controlled by making an optimized visual force page, for example. So, whatever. If you want to implement this type of approach because it meets your particular event notification system requirements, then you should know that there are different ways to do this on Force.com, and we're going to be demonstrating these different ways a little bit later. So please remember this discussion for that point.
Okay, thanks, Steve. So let's discuss the next approach, near real-time messages. So with this approach, and it lines up well with a lot of different kind of situations because users are not always going to be online staring at their browser. So we're really kind of tackling one of the cons of the previous approach. In this case, we are going to be sending somebody out in the field, maybe an email or a text messaging. And so it works very well when we need to be able to track those individual notifications and make sure that we're getting near real-time notifications out into the field. So what do you have to say about this approach, Steve, and how do you see Force.com developers implementing it?
Yeah, generally speaking, Josh, this is a really good all-around approach for event notification and an approach that is amazingly easy to implement for the majority of use cases without having to write a single line of code. So, for example, admins can go ahead and point and click to create a workflow rule that sends email or even triggers an outbound message to an external system. Or, then they can leverage the power of chatter and email notifications, right? Every record in Salesforce has a feed, which can trigger email to be sent when the record's touched in some way. And those emails can happen, for every post on the feed to the feed, or maybe a digest can be sent once a day or once a week if you're in a situation where events are noisy. So using non-programmatic solutions like this, workflow rules and chatter, you can tackle a wide range of requirements without writing any code. And the sharing architecture in place automatically makes sure that only the right users get those alerts. And this is really an extremely powerful feature of Force.com that every organization should fully understand and leverage. It's a real game changer when you compare Force.com to traditional app development platforms that require a lot of coding, very complex coding to handle this type of stuff. So, of course, that mentioned, there might be some more complex situations where workflow rules and chatter aren't going to cut it. So in these types of cases, you might need to go off and code some triggers, either on the objects in your schema or the associated chatter feed to handle your complex event notification business logic. It just really depends on your situation.
Right. And if you're in that realm where you are getting into code, you're adding some APIs into your solution, I previously called out both email and text messaging. Since we're on the Salesforce platform, we can call out to other APIs. If you wanted to send somebody a text message, you could, for instance, use the Twilio API.
Yeah, right. That's a good point, Josh. It's really easy to integrate Force.com with other systems, as you mentioned.
Okay, so let's look at the one final approach, deferred messages. So with this approach, we're really kind of looking at one of the possible situations from the previous approach where if maybe something is very, very noisy, right? So if I'm sending a notification every time an event happens, and I'm sending that every single time out to the field, then somebody may be getting notification. Deferred messages allows us to still have that ability to send notifications to users who may not always be online, may still be out there in the field, but the event notification itself is going to be deferred. So we're going to get maybe like a summary report at the end of the day, and we're going to send that out into an email. It's very friendly with large data set, and it really helps solve this whole noisy issue if the events are very frequent. So, Steve, how have you seen customers implement those?
Yeah, this is actually incredibly easy to implement with scheduled reports. So customers just go off and create a report that targets the data that they're interested in, and then they just schedule it to run at regular intervals. So what Salesforce does is then email the report output to users that have interest in the data. That can be one user or a group of users. It's all really easy to do and requires absolutely no coding.
All right, thanks, Steve. So let's summarize. Once you know your requirements, you can pick an approach that lines up well with those requirements and choose the right Force.com platform feature that we can use to implement to solve that. And these options range from point-and-click solutions. You can do a declared solution like a workflow rule or a scheduled report, or you can do more programmatic solutions like Visualforce and Apex. All right, so enough theory. I know you guys want to see the technology. We want to see some demos on how to implement this yourself. So let's show you how. Okay, as we demonstrate these various approaches, we'll use the same scenario we've been discussing, the hot open leads. Leads will either be created as open and hot, so it's a lead that a Salesforce salesperson is going to be wanting to catch up on very, very quickly. And we're going to have these three different solutions we're going to focus on: a dynamic Visualforce page, setting up a workflow rule, and then using the scheduled report. Sound about right?
Yep, let's go. All right, so let's get started with the dynamic web page approach.
All right, now I remember you saying that it's important for us to discuss there's different ways to implement that.
Yeah, right. Thanks for remembering, Josh. It's really important thing to understand. So we're going to discuss both options for implementing this type of approach, and then the reason is because we just want you to see both implementations and be able to recognize it, just in case this is something that currently exists in your particular org. So basically what we're discussing here with the dynamic web page is something that programmers know as the observer pattern. And there's two ways that subscribers in this pattern can get data about events: by pulling the data from the server, or by the server pushing data to them when events happen. So why are there two approaches? Well, the more traditional way of implementing the observer pattern is to pull data from the server, or to pull the server. And when events occur infrequently relative to the page refresh rate, traditional polling can waste a lot of system resources, both on the client side and the server side, because pages constantly refresh regardless of whether events actually occur. And it's also likely that users will miss events because events can come and go away, between refresh intervals. So a more modern and much more efficient approach is to have the server push updates to subscribers only when events happen. This approach is sometimes referred to as long polling because observers request the updates just as they would with traditional polling, but the server, it actually holds the request and responds only after something actually occurs that you're interested in. So the long polling approach is something that mobile apps use quite commonly because it's really lightweight and it meets the requirements of letting users know about something that's happened, like a tweet or a Twitter post.
So, good background. Now, let's show our viewers the traditional polling with Visualforce so that they can recognize it when they see it. Now, the easiest way to set up this kind of traditional polling with Visualforce is using the trusty old action puller tag. Basically, you're going to have your Visualforce page, you're going to have an Apex form in that, you're going to have an action puller component. An action puller is going to allow us to continually ask the controller for new data. So within Apex, we're going to set up a software query, and the software query is going to be refreshed, grabbing a new set and setting that back down to the Visualforce page. Code itself might look a little bit like this, and to a lot of the traditional Visualforce developers, this is going to look like a very friendly Visualforce page. We've got our controller. We're going to be looking at the lead list controller here. We're binding that down to the leads variable. We're going to be showing our page block table, and then we have got the action puller component down at the bottom here, binding that back down to an action, and we have an interval here of 15. So every 15 seconds, we're going to be going back to the server, right? So, Steve, what kind of observations do you have to add about this page?
Yeah, well, I think most viewers already recognize that this is really easy to implement, right? It's very, very lightweight. What's good, maybe, is that the page re-renders only a section of the page that contains the data records. So it attempts to minimize the network bandwidth consumption for each refresh. But, I got to say, that polling interval there of 15 seconds, that's pretty awful. When nothing changes, the page is still going to refresh every 15 seconds, which is pretty frequent. And then I want you to also notice that the action puller tag must appear inside a form tag, Apex form tag, which means that your page must manage view state, which, of course, can slow down response time, especially if there's a lot of data to manage.
Good point. So let's take a look at the controller. So it's a very basic, very simple Apex controller here. A few things to point out. You'll notice that the variable that we're binding down to Visualforce, we are actually giving that the keyword of transient, and that's going to actually help solve the thing that Steve was just talking about when it comes to the view state. The transient variable is going to be sent down to the client, but it's not going to be able to be sent back, so we limit the view state with that. Also notice that we have our with sharing attached to the controller. This is both going to enforce the sharing rules of the current user, but it's also going to provide the Force.com query optimizer with the opportunity to consider the org sharing configuration. So it's going to make that query go a little bit faster as well. And then finally, we wrap it all up with our pull action method that's going to return back our page reference so that we can similarly do a re-render there, and we're just doing the same query and reinstantiating that leads variable. So it's about as simple as you get. You have a visual force page. Every 15 seconds, you're going to refresh that list. So we're also going to see a live example of this page in a few minutes, but Steve, overall assessment of this approach.
Well, I don't know. I think in certain situations, Josh, this kind of traditional polling can work. It is easy to implement. It tries to minimize the resources it's using, but if you're doing refreshes every 15 seconds, that is most likely going to be extremely wasteful and very consumptive. Is that a word?
Yeah, I Googled it a little bit earlier. It means using up resources.
All right. So maybe I'm being redundant, but whatever. That's okay. It's because from that regard, this approach is kind of awful, right? So I mean, think about it. Let's drill into it just for a second here. If it's not just the resources that's going to be on our servers that be using it. It's the network bandwidth and the stuff your IT staff probably cares about. So just imagine, for example, your org has 100 users polling every 15 seconds, and of course they forget to log out when they go home at night. That's almost 10,000 page refreshes and database queries a day. And if you have 1,000 users in your org, we're talking about 1 million page refreshes a day. So if the database query that's powering that page targets a really large object and the query isn't very selective, then you're really just doing lots and lots of work for something that might not even show anything new. So I'd say if you want to go ahead and use this approach, you really need to increase the polling interval to cut down on resource consumption, but realize if you do that, then you run the risk of missing important events that might come and go before a refresh happens. So if you're using this type of approach to drive workflow, you're kind of boxing yourself in between a rock and a hard place, and I really think there's a really a better way to do this kind of thing that we'll talk about now.
Yeah, perfect segue. Let's talk about that better way. What we're going to do is utilize a little bit of push technology that's part of the Salesforce platform. This is a much more modern approach. So what we're going to have is, this is actually the architecture here is a little bit in the reverse. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to go to the Force.com database itself, and then in Apex, or you can also use Workbench, we're going to create what's called a push topic. And that push topic has different attributes to it, but the main one is going to be a query. So we're going to have a push topic, we're going to associate that back to a query, and then a client can subscribe to that push topic. And once a client subscribes to that push topic, we're only going to get information when that data has actually changed. So when a new record is created or a new record is updated, or in the demo we're going to see actually potentially deleted, we're going to be seeing this push down to the Visual Force page. So rather than do another vanilla implementation with the Streaming API, we put together an example that shows you how to do some things with the Streaming API that might not be so obvious, and let's explain that. So one thing to note, Streaming API can push to subscribers on inserts and updates. Now, considering our hot open leads opportunity, we also probably need to be looking at deletes. And so that's not going to really fit the Streaming API example. We have come up with here with the way that we can kind of get around this. And but before we get into this implementation, I do want to call out the fact that Winter 14 has increased the Streaming API limit. So one of the things that you should be doing for your due diligence, if you're trying to set up the situation, is to look to see how many users you're going to be having, accessing, and subscribing to these. Do note that Winter 14 has increased those limits. Okay, Steve, so walk us through the implementation we have, a specific example, and how it solves some of the problems that we're talking about, like the ability to track deletes.
Right. So what we're going to do in our implementation is use an intermediary object between the object that actually has the data of interest and our clients, in this case, the Visual Force page. So what we're going to do here is go ahead and create the push topic on this intermediary object, which we're going to call hot open leads. I abbreviated it here on the screen so we can fit it in. And basically what the use of this intermediary object allows us to do lots of really cool things. For example, some of the limitations that we showed on the previous slide about push topic queries, being able to join data. Josh mentioned the fact that we need to alert on deletes. You can do anything you want by simply setting up a trigger on our main object lead and then pushing the information that we need into our intermediary object and then describing the push topic on the intermediary object. So let me show you some code that demonstrates this type of implementation. So first let's discuss that intermediary object. Here you can see it's basically just a custom object called hot open lead. And because besides that obvious lookup field to the master object lead, there's two different types of fields in the object. The first type is a metadata field, action. It stores metadata about the action that took place on the lead record, add, update, remove, that kind of thing. Then there's a bunch of data fields that have the information that we want to display on the page. So we need to replicate it in the hot open lead object so that the push topic query, it can fetch it and then forward it to subscribers. And so Josh mentioned the push topic. You can create this in several different ways. You can execute some code in developer console, execute anonymous, or you could use Workbench to create a push topic with a nice little user interface. So whatever way you decide to do it, you give the topic a name, you specify the query that describes the data that you're interested in, and what type of operations you want to call out. So in this case, we use all because we want to be alerted on both insert and update. So, Josh, why don't you walk us through the controller, okay?
Yeah, so in this case, we're not going to be really using Visualforce components. We're going to be relying on a lot of JavaScript in order to power our application. So what we're going to do in Apex, instead of the controller setup we saw before, we're going to rely on an annotation called remote action. With remote action, we can set up a method that is static, and JavaScript can call directly into that method. So in this case, we have our query pulled into the static method, and then we're basically doing the exact same query we were doing before, and we're going to return those leads and exposing that down on JavaScript in Visualforce. On our Visualforce page, now that we're using a lot more JavaScript, we're also going to need to bring down a lot more JavaScript libraries so we can power our application. In this case, we're using a plugin for jQuery called CommentD, and CommentD is a client for the Bayou protocol. Bayou protocol is what the streaming API runs on. So this is going to allow us to use jQuery UI to build out our application and also subscribe back up to the streaming API. Oh, and we're also going to be using underscore, as many JavaScript developers may be familiar with. We're going to look at the templates. We're going to use that for client-side templating within Visualforce itself. So basically what we're doing is we're going to set up the template in JavaScript, and then we're going to access that remote action method that we had called before, and then we're going to fill the template with the leads that come down from the remote action. So with underscore, we're allowed to create that client-side template, and basically what we're doing is we're filling it with data and then grabbing the rendered HTML and putting it into a div. Now finally, the important part, once our page is set up, we are going to initialize the CommentD client. We're going to subscribe to that push topic that Steve had created earlier, and from that we can pass that down to a JavaScript function which is going to do things like decide what to do in the case of an update or a creation or a deleted record. All right, so we've looked at some code. Let's look at a live demo. Let's compare these two versions of the Hot Open Leads Visualforce page so that we can really see the difference between one implementation versus another implementation. So, Steve, I'm going to hand it over to you. I think the first thing we're going to do is look at the action puller component version. Is that correct?
Yeah, let me pop out of the presentation and we'll flip back over to an org, a live org here. Get my Windows set up. All right, so again, we're going to focus on the action puller page, which refreshes every 15 seconds. So if we update a hot open lead, eventually the page refreshes and we see the change. So that's really cool. Let me kind of show you the page is actually running here up on screen. So let me go ahead and just select some text just to prove to you that the page is actually refreshing. And then we'll see, notice my selection just went away. And that'll happen every 15 seconds whether I do something or not. So let's make it interesting here, and let me actually do something so that would make a difference. So I'm going to go over here. I have another window open, and you can see here I'm going to modify Betty Blair, which is the first lead on that page. And we'll scroll down here and give myself a little bit bigger window here so I keep scrolling so much. And we'll change Betty's first name to Sam, just so it's quite different. And so if we wait over here and, on the screen, it doesn't happen immediately because, again, we're in the middle of a refresh interval and there you see the change. Okay, so that's cool. Now, I want to emphasize one of the points that might have been a little subtle in the discussion about this implementation. So what I want to do here is I'm going to wait for the page to refresh again very quickly so that I can get the full 15 seconds to play with. So I've selected the text on the screen here. It should refresh in a second or two. Okay, there it goes. So I have 15 seconds to demonstrate this. So I'm going to go ahead and edit that record again, and then I'm going to change it to Betty, and I'm going to save it. And now I am going to edit it once again to Sam. Okay. Now, I didn't do it fast enough, but my point that I was trying to make is that if I did do it fast enough, you never would have seen that change. Okay? You wouldn't have seen that because the refresh interval exceeded the amount of time that it took me to go ahead and make the update. So I apologize it wasn't as fast there, but that was the whole point I was trying to make there. So anyway, let's go ahead and take a look at the other implementation, which is Hotlead's Streaming API implementation. So notice that the page here, it looks, almost exactly the same, or pretty much exactly the same. And let's show you how the page actually works now with all that cool JavaScript and remote actions that we had in place. So I'll go ahead and edit the record again. I'll change Sam back to Betty. And now look closely at the record in the other window, and you can see that there was a nice little yellow highlight, and that really is a nice visual cue for those salespeople that are actually looking at leads, right? They don't. In the other implementation, because the entire list gets updated, there's a good chance they're going to miss, individual singleton updates on the page. But in this case, as we go ahead and edit records, you can see first of all that the notification happens immediately on the page, and then you get that nice little yellow highlight. Josh, why don't you point out the other thing that's happening up here in the right-hand corner of the screen, because I think that's cool too.
Yeah, so as you are changing data and it's getting down to JavaScript, one of the nice things about this approach actually is because we have such a JavaScript-heavy application, it's very easy to integrate various features that you might have access to. In this case, what we're doing is we're leveraging something some modern browsers have where we can actually send a notification from the browser itself. Handy thing about this is that if you were somebody who your job was to watch this data, but maybe you're not actually looking right at this tab at that instance, you're going to have a little notification pop up and let you know that that data has changed, even if you're, say, just randomly, looking at Facebook or something.
I'm never looking at Facebook.
No, not during work. No.
Okay, anyway, so I think that ends this demo. We wanted to do these two approaches together again to show you the contrast of the different approaches so that you get a good idea of what the latter method affords you in terms of some other options. All right, so let's see if I can get back here to our session. Everything look good there?
Yep, I see the slides.
All right.
Okay, so let's take a little bit of a review here and consider the pros and the cons of the Streaming API implementation of this approach. So it does a very good job of keeping our resource consumption down. So once again, resource consumption, we're using up a lot of resources. What this is really going to do is let the page get those data refreshes. It's going to get it in near real time, but it's only getting the data that has changed as it's changed. So we've seriously reduced the amount of traffic that is coming down to this Visual Force page. The main drawback is that it's going to take a little bit more code to implement. We've moved out of this friendly Visual Force component realm where we can just drop some components in, bind it to an Apex controller, and run away. It does going to require somebody who's a little bit more comfortable with JavaScript. All right, so now let's tackle the next approach, near real-time messaging. Near real-time messaging. I think that's a new band, actually.
Yeah.
So in this case, we have an event such as a new hot open lead, and we want to be able to send somebody a message immediately. And one way to do this is with a workflow rule. Steve, how difficult is that to create?
Yeah, this is really easy to do, Josh, and we don't have to write a single line of code thanks to Force.com. So I'm going to switch back over into demo mode, and I'm going to demonstrate how to do that. Okay. So here we go. Pop into the main screen here. Now, the first thing that we're going to need to do is what we're going to do with our workflow rule is we're going to send out email. Okay, that's going to be the kind of notification that we're going to send. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to need to get an email template that's customized for our particular use case. Now, again, this is an intermediate level webinar. I don't want to sit here and build email templates in the middle of it, but I just wanted to show you the one that I created very quickly for today's demo. It's really simple. It's just like a mail merge thing, right? You got a bunch of static text, and then you have some dynamic information from our lead that we bind in here to the email, into the actual email that goes out. So let's go now and actually create the workflow rule. So I'm assuming that everybody has maybe done a little bit of workflow rules before. They're really easy to create. Josh, go ahead and start your timer.
Okay.
We'll see how long it takes for me to do this. Okay. So from the workflow rules page, you're just going to click New Rule, and let's see, we want to bind this to the lead object, right? So we'll go ahead and select that object, and of course we got to give our rule a name. We'll just call it HOL for Hot Open Lead, and let's go ahead and evaluate this rule maybe every time it's a new lead is created or edited. And then we've got to give the criteria down here that we want to fire it on. So let's see. The first one we'll do is, let's see, lead status equals, and then let's see if I remember correctly, it needs to be, we'll just use a pick list here. Yeah, we can't get it wrong that way. We'll click open, not contacted. And then the other one we want here is, let's see, I think it's lead rating. Let's see if I can find that quickly down here. And we'll set that equals to, and again, we'll use the pick list, hot open leads. Cool. All right. And there we go. We're just going to go ahead and save that. And now we just need to go ahead and add a workflow action. So remember, what we're going to want to do is do email. So we're going to do email alert, and we're going to have to go ahead and we'll go ahead and give it a description, and we're going to go ahead and specify our email template that we want to use, open lead notification. And now we have to figure out who we're going to send the emails to when this comes in. So we'll go ahead, and I'll use myself because I have an email client set up ready to receive an alert when it happens. We'll go ahead and click Save. And there we are. I mean, that didn't take very long, right, Josh?
No, it really only took you a couple of minutes, and to be honest, you could have done it faster if you weren't typing so much.
I know, I was talking a lot. Okay, so one thing to remember here is after you click Done on a new workflow rule, is remember to go ahead and click Activate, right? Because new workflow rules by default are not active, so make sure you don't forget that, or else you'll drive yourself crazy trying to figure out why nothing's happening. So we'll go in here into our back in our lead edit form. We'll just go ahead and clone this record, and we'll go ahead and save it. Create a new lead and see if we in fact get some email. And if I click over here, I have the Gmail set up, and there it is, right there. There's my new hot open lead. You can see the email template was used and it was filled in. And look here, I've got a handy link that directs the salesperson directly into the lead of interest that created the notification. So that's all really very highly functional. I didn't write a single line of code to do that, and I did it in a very short period of time. All right, so here we go. Back to our session.
Yeah, so reviewing the little pros and cons of that. One of the big pros of that is, as you were saying, there's no code. This is a purely declarative process, and it's something, as you showed, you can get up and running very, very quickly. It also solves this problem that somebody has to be sitting, looking at a browser, and making sure that they have, even with those tab notifications on, that they're being aware of it. We can send these emails out to our people in the field. On the downside, however, you might not want to be using this approach if these events are occurring frequently. So if a lot of these leads are being created, if you're getting 30, 40, 50 an hour, then that's going to get very noisy, and you're going to be filling up somebody's inbox way too quickly. So let's turn our attention to the final approach, deferred messaging. So for this implementation, assume that your requirements are going to allow for some significant lifetime. As the title infers, this is deferred messaging. So if the events are noisy, however, if we're getting that 30, 40, 50 leads scenario, it actually might be more desirable just to get a summary report of all of our hot open leads at the beginning or maybe the end of the day. So Steve, walk us through how you can build this particular implementation.
Sure. Okay. So let's get back into my development environment. All right. So remember, I think everybody's familiar with reports. If we go in and take a look at a report here for hot open leads, reports are really easy to build. And here's an example of essentially what we've been looking at throughout this entire session, right? A bunch of hot open leads. Lead status equals open, rating equals hot, okay? Now, typically, if you want to run the report interactively, you just click on the Run Report button, but in this case, we want to go ahead and pull down on that button and click Schedule Future Runs. And then what you would be doing here is just set up your schedule, right? When you want the report to run, you can actually set a preferred, run report time. You can do it every weekday, every day, all sorts of things. You can even go up here and decide who you want to email the report to. So by default, it's sent to me, but you can also go in here, and if we had, say, like a group of salespeople, it would be here on the list, and then I could go ahead and put that into the specification for this scheduled report. And then I would go ahead and just click this button and go ahead and schedule it. So I have an example already of the report that comes out in email. And let me pop that open real quick here. Here's an example of what you might get when you schedule a report. You can see it's the same information, right? So it's all very, very easy to do, as you can see, and again with no coding.
Excellent. Thanks, Steve. So let's review a couple pros and cons with that approach. One, so again, we are in the realm where we are not having to code anything, purely declarative process. We also have solved our noise problem. If we get 20, 30, 40 leads come through in an hour, I'm still only get that one email that has been scheduled to me. And it's also very good for large data sets. If I was tracking, 50, 100, 150 leads, I would have that all down in one report as opposed to a whole bunch of emails that are getting sent back to me. Biggest con is that there's a little bit of lag time. Obviously, we're only going to get that information when that email is sent to me, when I see that report. And because of that, kind of similar to the scenario Steve was showing with the Visualforce page, where changes have occurred in between when I first come into the day and then when I leave the day and I get that report, I'm not going to see the deltas of all these things. So I won't see if a lead has gone from hot to cold and back to hot again, for instance. Okay, so that is basically it for today's webinar. We hope you've got a better appreciation for the approaches Force.com supports for handling event notification. Many of these require no programming, and as Steve was showing, can be set up very, very quickly. Carefully consider these options, including Visualforce pages or pages that are going to be refreshing and causing data changes going back to the database. And as always, as good developers, we should be doing our due diligence, picking the right option that fits your application and business requirements.
Yeah, so to get the source code for today's webinar, head on over to GitHub, and I've put a repo up under my user ID. I made a bit.ly here, so that's really easy for you to write this down quickly if you're interested in getting some of the source code, especially some of the cool things that we did with the Visualforce page implementation. So if you missed something in today's webinar and you want to spend some more time studying what we covered here today. The inspiration that gave us this webinar today was an article that I wrote earlier in the year, and it's up on Developer Reports right now. So you can get to it. Just go to the Architect Core Resources page and go ahead and search for the word alert, and you'll find it. Again, the Architect Core Resources page is developer.force.com/architect. There's tons of other really good stuff up on the Architect Core Resources page as well. So I invite you to go up there as frequently as you want. Just be aware that we update it every week with blog posts from our team, and we write a lot of articles, and we do events like this one. And so I'm wondering, do we have a good Q&A going here?
We do have a few good questions on the table here. Very quickly, a couple of points of order I want to call out, though. There is a little event coming up in November. Steve kind of made a mention to it earlier. You might have heard about it. Called Dreamforce, I think it's called. So if you haven't registered for Dreamforce, there are still some slots open. And check out developer.force.com. Check out our blogs. We also are referencing those blogs as developer code that you can get, a promo code that you can get for a slightly reduced price.
Oh, yeah, Josh and I are doing a bunch of sessions, too, so check us out.
So if you want to meet us in person, we will be going over to San Francisco. We're actually currently right now in Chicago. We'll be heading out to San Fran for the event. Also, a quick note, if you didn't catch the bit.ly link earlier, the slides will be available online on developer.force.com, so don't worry if you were trying to grab a pen or a memo pad or anything like that. And also a quick shout out for another event coming up next week. Next Wednesday, I believe it is, a week from today, we are doing a webinar on Android development.
Oh, wow, that sounds great.
With Mr. Ryan Upton, and I believe Wolfgang Matherin is handling this webinar. So if you're interested in native development with Android, definitely check that out. Okay, so as I've been blabbering, I gave a little bit more opportunity to answer some, or get some more questions on the table. Here's an interesting one, Steve, and I'm actually not even sure I think I know the answer, but I'm going to pitch it over to you. Are you able to dynamically assign the email recipient of a workflow rule or scheduled report?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
I believe the answer is no.
Yeah.
I think you can hack the URL a little bit, so there may be a very sneaky way to do this, but I'm going to kind of go with no because I think from the normal declarative approach, I don't think it's an option.
I think you'd have to use something outside of the platform to do that.
Yeah. Let's see here. I want to create a new workflow rule on a newly created task. However, I cannot select email in the add workflow task when the root object is a task. Does that scenario come out as something you've run into before?
Yeah, there's certain limitations with different features on the platform based on what object that we're talking about. So in this case, the question is about specifically setting up a workflow rule related to a task. So it doesn't necessarily sound like you're doing anything wrong. It just may be a particular limitation of the platform.
Excellent. Now, while we were going through some of the pros and cons of the different Visual Force approaches, and we got into the hot open lead scenario, we were getting a few questions. We kind of answered them, but maybe it's good for a review. Obviously, normally with a streaming API, you can subscribe right to a standard object or right to a custom object and set up a query, get the information right from the object. But in this case, you designed an intermediary object, and we did that specifically to handle a couple of the things that the streaming API doesn't really cover. Is that right?
Yeah, and the one that when I first built that demo that I had in mind was deletes, right? So when I went through the demo itself, I only showed updates, right, which, of course, the streaming API can handle. But maybe a better part of the demo would be to go ahead and actually delete a user. And should I do that now, or what do you think? Do we have enough time to do that, or should we just keep going with the
questions? Let's keep going with the few questions.
Yeah, right. But the point is if you implement that in your own org and play around with it, you'll see what I mean. If you go ahead and delete Miss Betty Blair from the hot open lead, or change her status, from hot, or open to closed or whatever, that record will absolutely disappear from the list of hot open leads. And the way that we were able to work around that particular restriction in the streaming API was to use that intermediary object. So the trigger that we set up on lead, it just says, this lead was deleted, and it puts that metadata information into the intermediary object, and then we pick up with them and just push
correct with that. So as always, as you've been talking about in this webinar, it's a matter of looking at your requirements and what kind of options you have on the table. Maybe right the streaming APIs for you. In this case, it wasn't. So we've got a custom object that we're using.
Yeah, but too, make sure that you don't think out of the box, right? I mean, we've given you a really powerful tool as it is, but yeah, if there's a particular restriction that you need to work around, I was trying to demonstrate a way to think out of the box and come up with a way to implement what you need.
So a quick shout out to Charles Stevenson, who is reminding us that you can send emails to different addresses via workflow based on certain criteria like record number. So I think it depends on what your definition of a dynamic email address is. So there are a few things that that declarative would be able to handle for you.
Oh, cool. Thanks, Charles.
So what would the, let's actually go to,
what's that question right there?
Oh, for push topic, this is a good one. Thank you, Raymond. For push topic, is there a way to send an attachment, i.e. photos, documents, etc.? And I don't know, I think actually this is kind of getting back to what you're talking about of thinking outside the box.
Yeah, that would be a case where you'd actually have to, go ahead and extend the base system yourself, I think. If you look carefully at some of the restrictions that we put up there, the streaming API documentation, by the way, is excellent. So, go ahead and look at where, the limitations are for the streaming API, what you can do, and there's an entire section about what queries can contain the push topics, and you just need to follow those rules.
Right. So pretty much out of the box, no, but there may be ways around it if you architect your solution.
Right.
Always remember the push topic concept is to really send as little data as possible in order to get that notification down. So I think the idea of always sending down an attachment might also be, creating that traffic bandwidth.
Yeah, and think too, like a lot of this stuff is going to be used mobile, right? So you don't want to be sending, huge attachments to your mobile clients.
Right, exactly. Question from earlier. There is no way to call a trigger from a workflow yet. So you're not going to see it necessarily as an option in the workflow setup, but you could always do a field update and then have your trigger watch for that field update, and then you could trigger your Apex logic from that.
Yeah, right there. That's great. That's a great example of what we were just talking about. Is thinking a little bit outside the box and putting some stuff together to get your particular situation handled.
We mentioned this briefly. I was talking about how you could send email messages or possibly text messages out to the field. Text messaging is actually something which can be highly desirable for field agents because, believe it or not everybody in the world has a smartphone. It's a sad state of affairs, I know, but it's true. Sometimes you will have a workforce which may only be able to accept text messaging. If that is an option that is of interest to you, I would say go look up the Twilio API. It's an excellent API for doing both SMS messaging as well as dynamic voice options.
Yeah, and there are some great articles, by the way, on developer forums that show you how to do that. And it's really, really straightforward to go ahead and implement those.
Yep. All righty. Well, I think we've run through the FAQ questions that we had documented, so I believe we are going to go ahead and call the webinar a wrap. We will give you guys 5 minutes back for your day. I want to thank everybody for joining us today at the webinar, and hopefully you guys have a good work day and a good week.
Yeah, thanks for attending.